Okay, there we go. Hopefully everybody's seeing them. If there's any problem, hopefully Becky will let me know. And so let's go ahead and get started so that we know we have plenty of time, and that way hopefully maybe we'll be able to address some questions at the end. So I decided to talk about policies this month, every month with the Library Law Spotlight. I'm always trying to figure out something interesting to talk about. And since last month, the changes to the Library Privacy Act went into effect, which we know is going to affect many libraries' policies, if not everybody's. And there's just always constant change in lots of areas. So I thought it would be a good idea just to kind of go over some policy, how to set up policies, and just some information on developing library policies from a legal perspective. Okay, so that was awesome. This is my disclaimer. Which, simply because I'm not a practicing lawyer, I have a law degree, but I do not practice law. I cannot give you legal advice. I can give you legal information, but if you have a serious issue or you need to deal with some kind of situation, you're really going to want to talk to your attorney. So that's pretty much what this disclaimer says. Welcome. Here is the survey link. For those of you that are interested, you will be getting this on the email that will follow this presentation. And as always, here's my name and contact information. I'm always happy to assist wherever I can. I do ask for a little bit of patience. If you have an emergency, just please state that in the information that you send me, or if you leave a message, because I get quite bogged up. I get a lot of requests. And so I have to kind of work my way through them, and legal research can be really time intensive. So sometimes it takes an hour or two or more for me to work my way through a particular request. So that means that, there's only a certain number of requests I can accomplish in any one day. So, I get behind. So if I really am always happy to help, but you may need to, just have a little bit of patience, which usually everybody does, and I appreciate that very much. Okay, so let's talk about, why are we going to talk about policies today? Well, I mentioned a little bit because we had some changes here in the state, but also it's a good topic to constantly talk about because libraries are one of those entities that creates a huge amount of policies, right? So if you think about it, as directors and any board members that are on, there's a huge amount of policies that you deal with just by virtue of how you operate. So you have employment policies, you have facilities policies, you have patron policies, you have disaster policies, collection policies. There's all kinds of policies. And then on top of that, you have some complex legal requirements, because not only do you have the legal requirements for each individual policy, there are laws on employment, there are laws for facilities, there are laws for different kinds of patron actions, but you also have this overarching constitutional duty that every library has with protecting the First Amendment right to information. And so that can create some sticky situations, and also certain other laws that government entities have to pay attention to, which can just kind of create this really complicated situation when you're trying to deal with policies. It's not always as easy, as I'm sure you well know, as just saying, well, we want to make sure that the patrons don't do X. Sometimes there's a lot of layers you got to figure out there. The consequences of a bad policy can be especially bad with a library or any kind of public entity, because not only do you have your board gets involved because they're the legal face of the library, they're legally responsible for the library, so any lawsuit is going to include the names of the board on it. It can also engender a lot of cost, and for an institution that's funded by taxpayers and does not always have a lot of extra money laying around, having to pay legal counsel for a complicated litigation or having to pay settlement can be a lot of money, even if you have insurance, right? That's still, and plus there's public relations issues with your community. Things can have long-reaching effects. If you have a very big problem that kind of rumbles into the community, you can end up with, years of baggage and bad history that can kind of ripple through your library for lots of years to come. So having a bad policy is very often not worth, it just isn't worth it. So, that's another reason why you really want to kind of brush up on what are good policies, and you want to make sure you follow some basic rules for how to create a good policy. Oh, and this is a good slide. So I can see that I missed a slide. So what I want to talk about is policy versus procedure here. So if we talk about, what a policy is, right? So a policy is like a lot of times the big picture. A policy would be, no food in the library, right? But the procedure would be, how do we implement the policy? And if you're dealing with employees and a policy is, okay, you're not allowed to, let's say there's a dress code, right? We want to make sure that you dress professionally. Well, then the procedure would be, well, how are you going to make sure that the employees dress professionally, and what does professionally look like? So the policy is the big picture. The procedure is very often the details on how to get that done, or how to implement the policy, right? So with your typical patron or circulation policies, it's, patrons can only check out books for a certain amount of time. But the procedure is, well, how do you check out the book? How do you make sure the patron knows that they only can have the book for a certain amount of time? How do you get that book back? So that's just kind of a reminder not to confuse policy and procedure. Today, we're really talking about policies because those are the overarching authority for those procedures. So the policies are really kind of the things that more often than procedure, it's the policy that often gets entangled with the legal issues. So what are the components of a legal policy? Well, policies have to be, these 4 tenets are kind of the basic components of a legal policy. So first, your legal policy has to be legal, and that sounds kind of funny, but you have to make sure that it complies with applicable laws, and we're going to get into that in a minute. You want to make sure that your policy is clear. You want to make sure that your policy is enforceable, and you want to make sure that it encompasses due process. So first of all, when we talk about legal policy, we're talking about it being compliant with any applicable law and your constitutional duties, right? So under this comes things like you have to make sure that your laws have neutral application. In other words, you are applying and enforcing the law the same way to everybody, right? So as you hear lots of times with your meeting room policy, you can't restrict your meeting room based on the subject matter of the people using the meeting room, right? So if you're going to allow the Democratic Party to come in and use the meeting room, you have to also let the Republican Party, if that's what, if they want to use it. If you're going to let in the obvious thing is, if you're going to let in an activist group on a particular side of let's say a political question or an issue, you have to also let the other opposite side in. So if you're going to allow, a pro-choice group to use your meeting room, you also have to permit the pro-life people to use your meeting room. And that can get really kind of sticky, right? So this actually can determine sometimes a meeting room policy, because if you're going to permit, for example, the Anti-Defamation League chapter, or you're going to permit Black Lives Matter to use your meeting room, then you also have to permit people with an opposing point of view, and that gets very sticky, right? That can get very uncomfortable sometimes, depending on your point of view. But the key thing is that you can't restrict use of the library or use of the materials or use of the services by subject matter or by a person's point of view. You can restrict by behavior, right? You can have restrictions in your meeting room for what can be put on walls or how the room can, specifically be used. But you have to be really careful not to kind of push any particular agenda or favor any particular point of view within your policies. And certainly, of course, not to enforce a rule for one group and not the other, right? You have to watch things like financial laws, right? In this can also get very complicated. So every library should have good financial policies. And depending on your library establishment type, those rules may be different. So district libraries have a lot of autonomy. Municipal libraries don't have as much under the law in terms of some financial issues. Things like credit cards. If you have a credit card as a district library, you can just apply and get your own credit card. If you're a municipal library, so that's any kind of city, township, or village or county library, you have to go through your municipality to get a credit card. The library cannot, under the law, just go and get its own credit card, even if you're a PA 164 and you're pretty autonomous, right? So even if you handle your own money, under the law, you can't just go get your own credit card. You have to go through the municipality. So again, depending on your individual library situation, there are different requirements that you may have to follow. And this is partly what makes things so complicated. So, as a director, you kind of have to have a good handle on what your library establishment is, what are the laws that pertain to that, and in a particular, when you're looking at policies, you really have to get a good handle on, well, okay, what laws pertain to this, and what do I have to keep an eye on? Obviously, employment laws are a big deal. You have your public entity laws that govern things like contracts, and govern things like how you can spend, that govern things like, who can use what, like, for example, well, for example, you have, as a library, you have, under Michigan, you have a constitutional duty to let anybody in your doors. Now, you don't have to offer the same services to everybody. Obviously, your legal service area and your contracted area patrons very hopefully or largely will get privileges that anyone just walking in off the street from another area or a non-resident might get, and that's perfectly okay. But you can't bar your doors and say, okay, if you're not a resident, you can't come in. Then you have things like ADA or civil rights laws, right? ADA laws that require you to accommodate patrons that may have disabilities. You have the civil rights laws, which require that, again, you treat everybody the same, and that all, your policies and procedures, and from employment to patron, have to be evenly applied. First Amendment right to information. This is your constitutional duty. So that guarantees, not only guarantees that, so the First Amendment right to information says that everybody in the United States has a right to obtain information, right? They have a right to any kind of information they want. And this is kind of where the idea that, pornography is part of the First Amendment. But also, because courts have said that because libraries have this unique role in society, and very often a public library is considered the gateway for people to access information, that access to a library is critical to this First Amendment right of information. And so that puts kind of a burden on a library. So part of that, from that comes this idea that any rule of policy, a rule or a policy that you're going to implement, cannot interfere with someone's use of the library, right? So not only do you have to let everybody in, but any rule that you impose cannot interfere with their use of the library. Of course, that doesn't mean that you can't, for an infraction of your rule, you can't tell a person they have to leave. But for the rule itself, right? So when you're creating a rule itself, that rule cannot unreasonably bar people from the library. And so I've listed two cases here that kind of give some of those examples. These two cases are very famous in terms of library policies. The first one, 9S versus Columbus Metropolitan Library, has to do with shoes, right? So someone who was barefoot in the library. And this is a Sixth Circuit case. So this is actually the circuit that Michigan is in. So this case kind of dealt with, well, if someone who wasn't wearing shoes in the library was contesting that the library's policy requiring shoes was not legal. And the court essentially said that, you know, as long as that libraries, obviously as limited public forums, have the ability to have reasonable rules and regulations guiding the use of their facilities in order to make sure that, you know, the facility has a particular use, right? So the mission of a library is that access to information. So the rules that you create should be along the lines of protecting or kind of reinforcing this idea that libraries are this place where people can access information and satisfy that First Amendment right to their information. And therefore, activities that are not conducive to that or activities that interfere with that are the ones that you can regulate. And you know, when you're regulating them, you have to be careful that the person you're regulating, you know, the person you're enforcing it against, that enforcement is not unduly impairing their ability to access information, right? So this also came into play in that second case, which is Crimer versus Bureau of Police for the town of Morristown. This is the homeless case. And so what this case said is it dealt with, you know, the idea that libraries would kick out homeless people because of the way that they looked or the way that they smelled, or, and the court came back and said, well, you know, you can't restrict people, you can't restrict their access to information based on something that is not impairing people's ability to use the library. For example, you can't not let a homeless person in the library just because they look bad or just because they're dirty. You can, you know, perhaps enforce a rule if their presence is affecting other people's access to information. So that's kind of where the idea that if someone has a very potent smell and that is affecting other patrons' use of the library, then that is the reason why you could enforce that. But you know, again, you have to be very careful not to come up with a policy that is going to unduly restrict someone's access to information for a reason that really isn't pertinent to, like, isn't really affecting anyone else's use of the library. Or interfering with the purpose or the operation of the library as a place for people to access information. So you can see this gets a little complicated. And all of these laws are not, you know, this list I have here is not every law, right? It would just be slide after slide if I listed every law. But these are kind of the ones that are very commonly known. So then you also need to make sure that your policy has clear language, right? You need to make sure that your policy is clearly written, that the policy is, it's very clear as to what the goal of the policy is, right? If a patron reads the policy, they should be able to understand right away what is forbidden and what the consequences of the violation is, right? So what is prohibited, what is permitted, who it's applicable to, like who is covered by this requirement, and what the consequences of violation are. If there is a procedure, right? So for example, health screenings is a good example of this. So as a staff member, if you have, you know, if the library has a policy that says you have to be health screened, then there is obviously a procedure to health screening. So that should be available to the employees who are held to the health screening so that they can see exactly how they comply, right? So if it's not obvious how compliance with the rule works, then it's important to clearly lay out what is compliance, what constitutes compliance of this policy. And then where to go to ask questions. You know, what if I don't understand this policy and I don't want to violate the policy, but what if I have a question about this policy? Where can I go to clarify, you know, what I need to know to adequately comply? Is the policy enforceable? And this is important because you can have a lot of policies where you think, oh, this is a really good idea and we really need to do this. But then when push comes to shove, you think, okay, well, how are we really going to enforce this? And this a lot of times comes with situations where there's some objectivity involved, right? So if you have a rule on, people, like you could say PDA, right? Public displays of affection. Let's say that you have a rule for your teen section or even for the library as a whole, right? Because you don't want to, you can't really have a rule that applies to teens and not adults, that no public displays of affection. Well, then you'd want to define public display of affection, because what constitutes a public display of affection? What's a public display of affection to one person might not necessarily be a public display of affection to another. Is a friendly handshake a public display of affection? Is a handshake where they clasp the back? Is a hug? Is it just kissing? Are you really just concerned with activity that is closer to a sexual nature? So there are things that you have to enforce. Are you going to enforce it with all genders? Which obviously, if you're going to have that kind of policy, you'd have to. So you want to make sure that your policy is something that is easily identifiable when it's violated, right? So it's easy for staff or the people who are going to be in charge of implementing and enforcing this policy, security guards, or staff, so that they know clearly when it's being violated. Anything that requires subjectivity or some kind of judgment call is one of those areas that you want to make sure that the people who are enforcing it are very clear on what the goal of the policy is, and very clear on what constitutes violation and what doesn't, because that's when you get into trouble. An unenforceable policy is often those policies where there is just too much subjectivity involved, things involving hair or clothing, or those are things that can be just very unenforceable. So you want to make sure that not only is it enforceable, that the enforcement can be very neutrally accomplished, right? So you don't want to have a policy that is going to disproportionately affect one particular population of your library over another. Now, I'm not talking about, troublesome people over not troublesome people. I'm talking about, policies that are aimed at maybe certain cultural or certain characteristics that some parts of the population may have and some may not. So you want to be very careful about that. Things that involve any kind of cultural activity that could get you into civil rights issues. You want to make sure that the enforcement is reasonably accomplished, right? So you don't want your enforcement to have to be following somebody around constantly, right? You don't want your enforcement to have to be that, staff are going to have to be running somewhere every few minutes. You want your enforcement to be able to be reasonable, that your staff can really do, that can really accomplish, again, in a neutral way. You want to make sure your staff and patron safety is considered, right? So if you have a situation that gets out of hand and you have staff who are just not able to handle it, you want to make sure that your staff have a plan B, such as the ability to call law enforcement. Some libraries don't have a panic button, but you should definitely have, you don't have to have a panic button, but you should have some kind of procedure in place where if there's you could have the best policy in the world that's very even intended and very enforceable, but the situation just gets out of control or something you didn't expect happens, and you want to make sure that whoever is there to implement or enforce it is able to handle it. And you also want to make sure that enforcement doesn't go too far, right? So if someone is in the library and they either are demonstrating characteristics or activity that is unstable or that is threatening, you know, that's a situation obviously where, you know, you don't want your staff to, you know, maybe approach the person, or you don't want your staff to, you have to kind of draw a line and determine, you know, when is it just not going to be safe, even if the person, you know, sometimes, you know, again, there are situations that you don't expect. And even if there's situations where, you know, they're violating a policy that staff usually can very easily intervene and address, depending on the behavior that's going on, it may not be safe for the staff member to engage that patron for this even minor enforcement. And that's when you need to have a plan B. You want to make sure that your enforcers or your staff and the people implementing it, whether it's a staff or security personnel, are empowered to properly enforce these you know, these policies. So you want to have built into your enforcement of the policy a certain amount of autonomy for your staff to be able to act and make decisions given any particular situation. And that obviously is something we're going to get to in a little bit, which deals with due process. So you want to make sure that your implementation of your and obviously enforcement of your policy includes due process. Now, by due process, there's 3 different elements. You have notice, investigation, and appeal. So notice means that the policy is posted and easily accessible and easily understood by the people who are going to be required to follow it. So whether that's, again, employment policies, whether it's policies for vendors, or whether it's policies for patrons, you want to make sure that the policy is accessible. Best case scenario, your patron policies are on your website. And this is not only to help, you know, all your patrons get to it, but it also makes it so that any of your disabled patrons or patrons who might need, you know, to use screen readers or large print are available to access your policies and know what they are. If you know, you definitely want to have a print copy in the library, and perhaps you want to have some posted in the library. Investigation. So your enforcement procedures for any given policy are driven by clear evidence that there's been an infraction, or there is an, you know, someone is in the act of infraction, and objective investigation, right? So again, a lot of this is training. You want to make sure that your staff understands that, you know, there's a difference between someone looking like they're doing something and someone actually doing something. So you want to make sure that not only are your staff well trained on what constitutes violation of a particular policy, but that the patron also, when they're approached and when they're told they are in violation, that they're informed of what the policy is that they are allegedly violating. And then there's an appeals process. So the patron has the ability to tell their story and has an ability to, you know, if they feel that they were not in you know, breaking a policy, or they feel that there was a misunderstanding, or they feel they weren't treated appropriately, the patron or the employee or whoever is bound by a particular policy has the right to then appeal to a higher authority to get whatever justice they feel is due them. So generally that would be the board, right? So if you have a patron, but it depends on the situation and how big the library is, right? So if you have a library with lots of branches and you have a patron or an employee in a branch, they may go to their branch head, and then if that's not satisfactory, or they still feel that there's an issue, then they could appeal it up to the director, right, of the whole system and then to the board. But if you're a smaller library, then generally it would go to the director and then up to the board. So again, some of that appeals process depends on the type of library. And that's also something that should be outlined in your procedures, is what is the appeals process? What is the what is the policy? What is the enforcement method? What's the what is the penalty? And what is the appeals process? Those are all things that patrons or whoever's bound by a policy should know and should have access to, hopefully before they ever violate a policy, because obviously you can't be held to a rule you don't know about. So the policy making process. First, how do you figure out a policy? Well, first of all, generally it's you recognize there's a need, right? You realize, hey, or a staff member comes to you and says, hey, I think maybe it'd be good to have a policy on this. And then you research it, right? Or you tell your staff member, what, why don't you look more into this? See, what other libraries are doing about this. Search the internet, see if you see any articles. Sometimes people call me. And then you want to also consider, well, can our problem be addressed with a policy, right? If we do all this work and we come up with a policy, is that even going to help the situation, right? Again, can we enforce this if we make it a policy? What are all the issues going to be? How will this policy affect certain, our patrons in our community, right, as a whole, and in individual pockets of that community, right? What are the demographics of your community, and what are the specific cultural requirements of each of those pockets? Then you draft a proposal, or in some cases, again, depending on your library and how it works, your board may draft the proposal, the library director may draft the proposal, or the library director may ask a staff member or a department head to draft a proposal. In some instances, it's a committee that drafts the proposal. All of that, it doesn't really matter. It depends on your individual structure and how your library does things. It is a very good idea, regardless of how it's done, that the director is involved, because ultimately, on a day-to-day basis, from a practical perspective, it's the director who is going to be left holding the bag if something is not done appropriately. So it's very key that the director is involved in this drafting. And then you have refinement, right? So once you come up with a draft, now it's time to take it to a broader stakeholder. Again, depending on how you do it. If staff are not involved in the drafting, now that you have a draft, you invite staff to look at it, because staff, if they're the ones who are going to be required to enforce this, only makes sense to have them take a look at it, right? Because if the director, goes home at 5 o'clock and there's staff there at night, you want to make sure that the staff that are left alone there at night feel comfortable and feel confident enforcing this and understand what the purpose of it is. So it's not that the staff are dictating what happens, but it only makes sense to have some staff input, because as we all know, there are things that happen when the director isn't there that there's things that staff deal with that the director doesn't deal with, right? For many years, I was in a administrative position, a pretty high administrative position for large academic libraries. And, there would be stuff that would happen on the weekends and nights when, I wasn't there or the dean wasn't there. And you can't, you have to make sure that the staff who are going to be required to handle it are able and willing to handle it, and that it makes sense for them to handle it. So that's really important. You want to always make sure, hopefully, that you contact your attorney, right? You want to make sure that your attorney also is involved somewhere in this process, either when you're drafting it or after you've drafted it and you have a proposal, or you're in the refinement period. And the reason for this, that unless you're dealing with a very simplistic policy, right? Some of those everyday policies that you make on the fly, which really are not anything that have, severe legal impact, right? But if it's a policy, again, that has to do with patrons' ability to use the library, or where the ultimate um, uh, punishment could be banishment from the library or could affect their ability to obtain that information. Or if it's some kind of sticky situation where, again, it might involve an ADA issue or a civil rights issue, you definitely want to make sure that you get your attorney's input. Or if it's implementing a particular law, right, an employment law or a workplace law or again, a civil rights law, because that's just, it may cost some money, but it's better to do it up front than to end up spending money in litigation. And most attorneys won't charge a huge amount of money to review a policy. You want to then, once that's all done and you're confident with it, you want to submit it for approval. So again, depending on your process, at the end you submit it to your attorney. But you definitely submit it to your board. Again, depending on the board and what kind of authority they've delegated to the director or a committee or whoever is doing the policy, the board has to approve policy, especially, again, far-reaching policy or policy that is implementing a law or policy that could affect patrons' use of the library, because remember, boards in Michigan, governing boards in Michigan are the legal representative of the library. Like it or not, boards are the boss of the library, right? So they are the ones that hold all the authority for how stuff can be done. Now they can delegate that authority to the director, and hopefully they do delegate a fair amount of it to the director, so that the director can accomplish their day-to-day work. But at the end of things, if someone's going to sue the library, it's going to be the board's names on the lawsuit. So it's very important that the board is not only knowledgeable about every policy in place at the library, so they should have a copy of the policies, but they also are involved and approve any new policy or amendment that gets put into place, especially with these larger, more serious types of policies. And again, that's just the way it is in Michigan. And then after the policy's been approved, now you have training, right? And training is key. Whoever's going to enforce this policy, and your front end people, so people that might be advising patrons on policy, not just the enforcers, really need to understand not only what the policy is designed to do, but how it's enforced and what constitutes a violation. And sometimes they need to know specifically how to enforce it, how to approach people, how to have that discussion. And then you need to make sure that patrons are notified that there's a new policy or that there's a change to a policy. Now that, depending on the severity or the drastic nature of the policy, if you have a very new, big, far-reaching policy that's drastically changing something, you would want to put out a fair amount of notice to the public to say, hey, we're going to be changing this, so in X number of days, be ready. But in terms of day-to-day policies, you just want to make sure that there's a little note on your web page, hey, policies have been updated, you might want to take a look at them, right? So that, again, the public is on notice that there is a change to a particular policy. And again, easy access to policies that have been changed. In developing your policy process, so in terms of looking at how policies are created in your library, you really need to understand and know who has the authority to create policies. Has the director been given authority by the board to create policy? Does the board expect the director to create all the policies? Does the board expect to create any policies? I know there are some libraries where the board creates the policies. And if that's the situation, then again, the board needs to consider this from the standpoint of, okay, we have authority, but the director should be involved, and who has to implement these policies. Who has the authority to approve a policy, right? So sometimes that's not the same thing. The person who creates it is not the person who approves it. Is there a different process depending on type of policy? So are there everyday kind of on the fly policies that, do not have to go through a formal policy, or excuse me, a formal process, as opposed to some larger policies that do have to go through a formal process, like many employment policies. The ones that really affect and are, an employee's ability to work are the kinds of things that you'd want to make sure that that's very carefully vetted and worded and looked at, as opposed to an on-the-fly policy that, is not really, the violation of it isn't going to result on, for example, being fired, right? So that's something that's more of an on-the-fly policy, like, everybody has to do their own dish in the lunchroom of the library, right? Staff are responsible for their own dish because someone keeps leaving that disgusting dish in the sink and nobody is cleaning it. So, that's more of an on-the-fly policy. Of the policies that are created, how are they amended? Again, is there a formal amendment process? Does the director or staff member just identify in a staff meeting a policy that's a problem? Hey, we've noticed that this is kind of not easy to enforce. We think it might be easier if we did X, or if we tweaked the policy to say Y. Now, does that have to go through the board? Does it have to go through a committee? Can the director just make the amendment and run it by the board? Those kinds of things. And then who is included in the process? How far do you go to include people? Are there different groups for different types of policies? And I imagine, it would probably work better if there were, again, those policies that are more serious and far reaching would be the ones where you might want to get more stakeholder input than that one about the dishes in the sink. And then, should your attorney draft the policy? Again, I cannot strongly recommend enough that any of the larger formal, particularly employment and patron policies, get reviewed by your attorney, right? So as you create new policies, again, the policies that the punishment for infraction is serious, affects the ability of a patron to use the library, those are the policies you really want to make sure your attorney views. Same thing with employment. If the infraction could be firing, you definitely, or change in schedule, you definitely want to make sure those get looked at by your attorney. So again, we've talked a little bit about what's the director's role in all of this. So, again, a lot of times identify, determine what policies are necessary, often drafts the initial policy. If authorized by the board, may approve the policies, train staff, and depending on the library, may be someone who enforces the policies, or could be an initial appellate level, again, depending on the size of the library. The board, as the people legally responsible for the library, they, in some cases, heavily influence the process, because if they decide they want to be in charge of the policies, they have that legal ability to do it. Now, often I tell boards, just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean you should do it. So should they be in charge of the policies? Maybe some, but not others. There's some arguments there. And so that is one of those things that having a good relationship with your board really helps a director, because a director has the unique ability to really influence the board and kind of explain how libraries run and what best practices are. But the board should be able to understand what the policies are, know what the policies are, and have final review and approval on policies, particularly, again, those policies that are far reaching or that are, serious, large, important policies that, they could involve litigation if they're not handled appropriately. And then the board is the appellate body. Staff. So staff should be involved as reviewers. They can be drafters. They can be people who initialize the idea that a policy is necessary. I like the idea of staff being involved, and that's because, again, my experience is in larger libraries where there are lots of staff who work all hours. And a lot of times staff are really uniquely positioned to tell you when a particular policy is just not working, or when a policy needs to be tweaked, or when a policy might be very effective, and to help you understand what kinds of enforcement would be useful And you know, that's really kind of invaluable. They are good indicators of need for revision or update. Often they can determine if a policy is successful, you know, as again, the people who enforce the policy. For a long time, at least in academic libraries, there were strict food policies. And, you know, especially during certain times of the term, you'd walk around the library and there was just no pretense. You're talking like a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken on the table. And you're talking about, you know, study rooms with, you know, just almost, you know, full buffets laid out. I mean, there's just no pretense. And so it got to the point where, like, during exam time, if you've ever worked in a library during exam time, and tried to approach a student who's been studying for 24 hours and has like a cheeseburger on the table, you almost withdraw a stump if you try to remove that. And some very quickly you discover that it's almost not worth it. The fight that occurs, the like the whole like distraction to everybody around you when the student starts to scream at you, then the whole enforcement process and getting campus police, and you know, all of that just in the end turns out to be just not worth it. And so pretty soon, based on staff that told us, look, we're just not enforcing it because it creates a huge amount of mess, that, you know, even to students getting mad and dumping drinks over or just leaving food. So, you know, quickly, you know, we had an idea that we created a place in the library where people could eat. And then, you know, it was kind of like an agreement thing where we told students, look, we're going to let you eat in the library, but if you can't properly, you know, throw stuff away and stuff, we'll take it back. And it actually ended up working out. So that's kind of an example of, you know, staff coming and saying, look, this just isn't working. Right. I remember having discussions when I was working in a law library, having discussions with law students over what constitutes food. And it, you know, law students are being taught to argue. Right. So, you know, I've had this like 15-minute discussion with a law student on whether gum was food, and not because I was trying to get them to throw away gum, but because he kind of kept taking it to the next level. And so it just, you know, after a while, you're just like, you know what, this isn't working. Let's see what we can do. Now, security personnel also is important here, and some of what security personnel can do is determined by your contract with the security company. So if you contract people from a security company, your contract very often details what that security person is permitted to do in terms of enforcement and what they are not permitted to do. So that's another thing to consider in determining procedure or determining policy, is that you want to, you know, talk to your security personnel and say, okay, this is the plan for enforcement and this is the policy we want to implement. What do you think, and how do you think this would work? So that, you know, you don't go through all this process and come up with a really great policy only to find out that your security person is unable to enforce it for you. So people ask me, you know, when you're drafting policies, how do you get language for policies? Well, there's essentially 3 different methods that I could come up with. The first one is the sample method, right? So you go around and you look at policies from other libraries, and you say, okay, let me see what other libraries do and what their policies say. And then you either modify their policy or you just copy it as a template. Now, the pro to this method is that it's easy, right? And in some cases, you can kind of assume that, well, I bet this has already been legally vetted because this is a big library. They have lots of money. They probably already passed it through their attorney. So chances are that, you know, this is a good policy, right? So the con, though, is that you're not sure it's been through the attorney, right? You can assume, but you might not always be right. Or for all you knew, the policy that you took, they took from another library and then modified it before you got it. So it may have started off as a legally fine policy, but then by the time they got it and now you have it, it's been tweaked enough that now maybe there are problems with it. It may also not fit your particular library type, your establishment type, or your municipality, because remember, you also have to look at local laws, right? Most often, local laws shouldn't affect your general patron policies, but depending on the policy you're taking, especially when you get to things like financial policies, there may be some differences in how different municipalities want financial issues to be dealt with. And again, depending on that and depending on your establishment type, the policy you pick may or may not be appropriate for you. So the do-it-yourself method, right? So just starting and writing the policy from scratch. So the pro for this is that you can end up with a really good, well-tailored policy if it's done correctly. The con is this can be very time consuming, right? It requires a lot of research. It requires a lot of writing and revision. And it can result, if it's not done correctly, in a problematic or illegal policy, right? And then you have the attorney ready-made method. Well, so the attorney, where the attorney drafts contracts, drafts the policy for you. I apologize, I threw contracts in there, I meant policy. My brain, it's Friday, my brain is not working this morning. So the and I'll change it before we send the slides out so it's correct. The attorney ready-made method of policies is the pro of that is that it's easy, right? This is probably the best way to do policies. You talk to your attorney, you tell them what you're looking for, you tell them what you'd like the outcome to be and what the goal of this policy is, and then they come back with a policy that hopefully does what you want and is completely legal, right? Requires very little time on your part, and it comes back all nice and put together, and you submit it to your board for approval, and then you train your staff on it. The problem with this, obviously, is that it involves a cost. And depending on your attorney and what they charge, and how new the policy is, many attorneys who handle library law handle more than one library. So, they're well versed in the different types of libraries and how to tweak them. So they'll come up with a policy and then they'll just tweak it for the different libraries. So the initial cost and effort comes in that initial drafting of that policy. Once they've done it for the first library, well, now they have it. Or once they've done it and then they have it ready in anticipation that libraries will look for it, now it's ready. So a lot of times, it can, if you're asking for a policy that's not a brand new policy, so it's not a brand new law or a brand new change, chances are that policy may not be as expensive as you might think, right? Because your attorney is not going to be spending the same kind of time they'd be spending if they did it from the beginning, because they already have one they could tweak. So that's something you want to consider. So again, if you're talking about, I would look at this with a risk benefit analysis, right? If you have a policy that is a very big deal, important policy for your library, right? It involves the ability of patrons to use the library and could result in litigation if not done properly, right? So for example, policies that involve whether or not people can petition in the library. That involves not only free speech, but political speech, which is one of the most protected speeches in First Amendment law. And as a government entity, there are some sticky things there, right? So, if you're unsure about how that policy should work out, that's probably a perfect one to go to your attorney with, because that's the kind of one that, if someone gets angry and wants to bring a suit against, that's something that could cause you a problem if what you're doing is not correct. Same thing with your meeting room policies. All of those kinds of things, I would definitely consult with your attorney on to get a policy. And like I said, they've done it for other libraries if you have a library law attorney. So chances are it's not going to be as expensive as you think. And I always tell libraries, I tell boards, investing in an attorney is money well spent. So it's again, it's one of those things, cost of doing business things. So now that you have all your policies in terms of managing those policies, you want to make sure you update your policies. I cannot say this enough. You can't just assume that, I have these policies. I became a director 10 years ago. I have these policies. They've been working fine. So if it's not broke, don't fix it. I just, address it as things come up. No, you should be reviewing policies at, every year optimally. If you just can't, if you're understaffed or that's just not realistic, then every other year. Don't take this, we've always done it this way, so it must be okay. I would not take that stance. We have a phrase here in the Library of Michigan, and it's, it's not a problem until it's a problem, right? You never know when you're going to get that person who's going to come in and challenge something. And then you're going to find out that, oh my God, we've been doing it wrong all these years. Or maybe you haven't, but there's always that chance. So please review your policies. Plus, there may be something that, years ago wasn't an issue and you didn't have to worry about. And now it is an issue and you didn't even realize you could have a policy on it. So by reviewing your policies, it can kind of jumpstart some thinking about, well, here we have this current issue and, oh, I didn't know that was something that we were even able to address. Because laws change, your community changes, and technology changes. And all of these things can have an impact on your existing policies. So again, it's important that you review your policies. You don't have to do them all at once. You can just do it bit by bit. You can take, we're going to review employment policies, this quarter of the year, and we're going to we're going to do employment policies this year, we're going to do patron policies next year. But it's important that you do review them. Equity, diversion, and inclusion. I wanted to mention this with policies because this is something that is obviously and rightly so a large discussion right now in the library world. And these are factors that are important in terms of policy and in enforcement. So if you're a library and your legal service area and your contracted area is very diverse and includes lots of different communities, then there are some things that additional things you're going to want to consider when you're looking at policies and enforcement of policies. And some of those are things like the impact of involvement of law enforcement, right? In some instances, law enforcement is one of those things that, we're just, like in some academic libraries I worked in, it was like, what, if you have a question, just call the police. Well, that's not the same for all communities. Some communities, communities of color, marginalized communities have a very complicated relationship with law enforcement. And the staff may feel that calling law enforcement is not a big deal and no one's going to get hurt and it's not going to, they're just going to help me, de-escalate the situation, but it can actually cause a lot of trauma. So, those are the kinds of things that you want to think about depending on the communities that you serve. And so, you may need to tweak your procedures of when you do involve law enforcement and how you involve law enforcement. Similar with things like the impact of touch or voice or using particular phrases. Again, depending on the community that you're dealing with. There are some, disabled communities. There are some cultural communities where, touch, particularly by different genders, is again, very traumatic and considered very offensive. So, you don't have to be an authority in every single culture, but if you are a library that deals with a significant population or, has a community of a particular culture in your area or a particular, type of community, then it's only right to understand a little bit about that community and how certain types of enforcement could turn out very badly, because it's good for you and it's good for them. You want to make sure that, you may want to consider involving representatives of patrons from those diverse communities in your policy and enforcement development, when it's applicable. So again, when you're dealing with those big kinds of policies, or you're dealing with, if you have an issue that's ongoing, you have an issue that is you're having a problem with and you're not sure how to deal with it, and it involves a particular community, then bring in representatives from that community and figure out, what is the best way to address this and what kinds of procedures are appropriate. Consider staff training on effective interactions with those with mental and emotional issues, including things like dementia and autism and other kinds of, and then mental health issues, because, there are certain effective techniques to working with them that can make all the difference between a good interaction and enforcement situation and a very bad one. If you do have a big community of a different culture and different languages, maybe have your policies translated into the language of that community, right? Because it can only be helpful for that community to understand the rules of the library. And putting it in their language it also welcomes them and lets them know that the library wants them, and the library, it is interested in having them be a part of the library community. And then ensure your policies are accessible to those with disabilities. So if you only keep your policies in print in your library, then that's a problem for members of your community that have vision issues. Make sure, train your staff on conflict and de-escalation techniques. There are some really wonderful courses in Web Junction and Niche Academy available on the Library of Michigan's website. They're just, do it yourself, virtual kinds of courses. The content is great. And, it would be great just to tell staff, look, when you're not busy, just put this on. Or we expect that maybe one time a month you do, a class in one of these areas. So, it can be extremely helpful and useful. Talk to your security personnel. If you use security guards, have they had training in these areas? Do they know how to deal with people who have emotional and mental disabilities? Do they know how to deal with elderly people with dementia? Ask these questions, because again, it could be the difference between a good interaction and a bad interaction. So here are some resources that I've compiled on a whole bunch of different things, including equity inclusion. Here's links to those 2 cases I mentioned if you're interested in reading them. They actually are pretty interesting from the idea of, the First Amendment perspective and creating policies. And then a whole bunch of things on policy development from different state libraries. It's important to note that these policy development links will not be specific to Michigan. So it's important to know that when you're drafting policies, you have to pay attention to the individual state laws. And if you have any questions, or you have a particular policy that you would like a little maybe consultation on, you can certainly contact me. Again, I also strongly encourage you to contact your attorney. And I very much thank you for being here today. We are 3 minutes over, but I have the room until 11:30. Because I always schedule it for an hour and a half so that we have time for questions. So I am not sure if we have a lot of questions. So let me look in the chat here, what we have. So it looks like we have a few questions. Okay. What if it's a Holocaust denier? Those are really opposite groups. Yeah, this is a very hard, this idea of needing to represent both sides and including all sides is very sticky. I actually have conversations with my family about this, and I routinely am on like all alone on the other side of the table as my two college kids and my husband tell me that under no circumstances should an organization like the Proud Boys or the KKK be allowed to use the library for a meeting room. And I'm like, dude, I did not write the First Amendment. I just tell the law. I don't create it. But unfortunately, that is right now the law. So how can a library manage it? Well, one of the things you can do is just draft your meeting room rules very carefully. You know, sometimes it's better just to say, we're not permitting those kinds of meetings at all, so that you don't deal with that. If you feel strongly that you should deal with that, then one way to deal with it is, you know, you don't have to seek these groups out, right? So if you have a, you know, again, like a Black Lives Matter group come in and use the library, you don't have to go out and look for, you know, a right wing, you know, very, very, you know, a Proud Boy group to come in. You just can't deny them if they come in and ask. But what you can do is you can somewhat limit their actual activities in the room. You can't limit their speech, but you can limit, you know, you can limit, as again, as long as it's the same for everyone, you can limit the amount of time the groups use the room. You can limit the, you know, the ability to put up flags, the ability to put up signage, the ability to put out literature. You can require that it all stays in the room and that they bring all of it with them, that they don't leave any of it behind. You can require them to monitor their volume. So there are things that you can do so that, you know, they're not leaching into, you know, trying to, you know, promote their agenda in other parts of the library. You know, that's, you know, those are things you can do. So the important part is, you know, you have to give equal opportunity and the rules have to be the same for everyone. But that doesn't mean that you can't implement certain rules. So that's, again, something that you would talk to your attorney about if you feel, and the ALA has some excellent things on their website too, which is, you know, I have links to in the end of the presentation. But I agree, it's and I can totally see why you would be harassed by the public. Again, I told you my family gets after me. And you know, it can get to be very, very difficult. So those are the questions. Again, it might depend on your community. And so it might depend on the difference between saying, you know, maybe, you know, we don't, you know, maybe we're careful about, you know, how our meeting rooms are used in general. But it's, and again, also look at your local rules. But you have to be really careful about this idea that if one group uses the room, the other one gets to use the room, because depending on the situation, you know, sometimes these groups will try to use the room and it's a test, right? So it's activists that want to stir up trouble. And so they use it as a test just so that now they can levy a lawsuit. So that's why, you know, again, you have to be really careful. And it's better to err on the side of, you know, letting them use the room. But again, you can implement certain restrictions on the use of the room as long as you implement them to everybody. Our computers are visible to the kids area, so are we legally not allowed to tell a patron no pornography because children can see it? That's also kind of a sticky area. Technically, part of this depends on, and I just actually wrote a little course on this. So it depends on, some of this depends on what you're calling pornography. If because there's pornography, the First Amendment protects pornography, but it doesn't protect obscenity, right? And there's this whole test for obscenity. So assuming that the content is not child pornography, is not violent sexual activity, is not, you know, something that's patently offensive to our culture, like bestiality or, you know, something like that, assuming it's run-of-the-mill pornography, yes, a person has the right to view it. But yes, the library also has a separate law that requires them to restrict children from viewing harmful sexual content on computers. So some of the ways that you can deal with this is you could just filter all your computers as a way to comply with the Library Privacy Act section on protecting children from the internet, sexual content on the internet. But even that law requires libraries to have at least one computer that the filters can be turned off for adults. So you may want to take that one computer and put it in another area of the library, or put a privacy screen on it where, you know, take one computer and put a screen on it, you know, the privacy screen that nobody can see what it is other than the person directly in front of it looking at it. Or, you know, have a separate device, an iPad or, you know, something separate that when a patron asks for, you know, an unlocked computer or a computer that's not you know, that is not filtered, that's what you can hand them and, you know, say, this is the area that you can use the adult content computer on. That, you know, I would recommend those. If every computer in the library is filtered, then you can blame it on the Library Privacy Act, that's a requirement. But again, that is requiring that at least one computer can be unlocked. SIPA, if you have E-rate, SIPA requires every computer and your internet, your Wi-Fi to be, if it's used with E-rate dollars, to be filtered. So that again is kind of an easy out for you. But, you know, again, if in this situation, you pretty much, again, this is one of those judgment calls. The legal side is that I would say, yes, you have to find a way for this person. There should be a way in your library for this person to be able to view pornography if they want to view it, according to their First Amendment right. But, you know, it is also possible that, you know, because again, according to the library, if you're not on E-rate, the library's Privacy Act says you have to have at least one computer that can be unlocked for adult use. So it's really hard for you to say, well, none of our computers can permit this. So yeah, you pretty much would have to permit one. And I would suggest maybe a privacy screen would probably be the easiest, most economical way to do it. You know, or an iPad in the adult, you know, adult area. But you certainly, remember, can regulate behavior. So pornography is not behavior. They have a right to view pornography, but they don't have a right to behave in a way that is inappropriate. So sometimes you could also use that if you're seeing something that, you know, they get on the computer and you're seeing something that's right. For example, if they're encouraging children to come over or young people to come over, or they're harassing staff, then you can deal with it on the basis of behavior and not on the basis of what they're watching. What about policies about unattended minors? You can have policies on unattended minors. Again, that's a question of, you have to be just careful about what you do. You can you can have a policy that says we're going to call, you know, if we have children at the end of the day whose parents are not here, we're going to call the Child Protective Services, and that's fine. You just have to make sure that this is, you know, noticed, that the parent, you know, that this is noticed to the parents that this is what the policy is about unattended minors. You can tell parents that, you know, you can have an age range any child under a certain age, you know, cannot, should, you know, I think, you know, you could say must be accompanied by an adult. Um, the, you know, it gets harder as the kid gets older. But you know, for little kids, for sure, you can require that a parent, you know, that they're in the library accompanied by adult. You can certainly require use of the computer. But as far as, you know, when push comes to shove, what do you do about unattended minors if nobody shows up or if they're just alone? Then you can call HRS. I would talk to your attorney about the correct way to word that. You may also want to consider, like if you're having problems with unattended minors, you might want to consider why, like, is it all from one school? Is it all from one community? And because, yeah, that's a tough one. Yes, you can have a policy for unattended minors. There are lots of libraries that do. I guess part of it is exactly what kind of policy you want to have. If your concern is about, like I said, at the end of the day, what do you do about them? Or is your concern about, we don't want any coming in the library at all? Not having anyone come in the library at all is kind of, you know, unintended minors. That gets sticky because I think you'd have to have a certain age limit. But you know, that's something, you know, we can have a longer conversation about later, or I would encourage you to talk to your attorney because, yeah, unintended minors is a sticky problem. I agree with you. But a lot, again, there's some of this that just is, it depends. I have a board member who says that if we allow people to sell in the meeting room space, we can pick and choose who can and cannot sell. Absolutely not. You cannot do that. Yeah, no, if you open the room, yes, if you have a community room and you let people come in and sell, for example, you let LuLaRoe come in or you let Girl Scout cookies come in, then you have to let other people come in. Now you could word it like nonprofit, you know, so if you want to permit like the Girl Scouts, you could word it so that nonprofit entities can offer, you know, can hold fundraising. And so that would be like the Girl Scouts and the Boy Scouts, but it would also include other nonprofit entities that fundraise or that have, you know, sell things. And that would be nonprofit versus commercial enterprises. So that, again, the LuLaRoes, the jewelry sellers, the Tupperware, that would all be considered commercial, as opposed to, like, you know, the school band in there selling chocolate, or the, you know, which would be nonprofit. So there are ways you can do that, again, depending on what your goal is, but you can't arbitrarily say, well, you know what, we think that this is going to be messy and we think that this is going to cause trouble or attract a certain kind of person, so no to this one, but yes, this is a bunch of cute kids selling stuff, so yes. Or this is my friend who sells LuLaRoe and she's a really nice person and I know she'll clean up, so she can do it, but this person can't. That's what you want to avoid. So if you have clear guidelines that clearly differentiate in an impartial way, then likely that would be okay. But you can't arbitrarily do it, for sure. Okay, I think we have all the questions. It's 11:18. I hope that all of you have a good, I see the sun is now finally peeking out in Hazlitt. Maybe it traveled over from Midland. So thank you, Midland. We're getting a little bit of sun here now, which is great. And I hope all of you have a nice, good, sunny weekend. I'm going to stop my share so I can see everybody. I hope y'all have a good weekend, and I look forward to talking with you some more. And next week we have our library director. A week from today, we'll have our next library director meeting. And so we'll talk about everything that the governor talked about yesterday. And who knows, we might have some more stuff to talk about. So I hope everyone has a good week. Thanks a lot for coming. I really appreciate it. And please fill out your survey. Thanks a lot. Bye.